Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome back to the Enterprise AI Show. I'm your host, Brian Gracely. And today, a couple things. I'm recording this, I know, a day late. I said I was trying to do this on Fridays and Wednesdays and Fridays. Getting this out a day late. Work has been kind of overly busy, which is a good problem, but it got me a little behind. So I'm putting this one out on a Saturday. I'm going to try and get back to the Wednesday, Friday schedule next week and try and be diligent about holding to that. I think it's a little better for anybody who's trying to just, include podcasts in their weekends. But anyways, I hope everybody's doing well. It's June 13th, the day after SpaceX launched. Whether or not people care about that, it'll probably end up being in one of your portfolios, probably through some sort of index fund or something like that. But did relatively well. I think it was up about 20%, which is kind of what was expected. I was thinking about it. Everybody has, kind of a story as to, how certain things relate to your life. I've got, I believe, 3, what we'll call sort of Kevin Bacons, 1 degree away, 2 degree away Kevin Bacons from SpaceX in one way or another. First one for us is if you go back to, I believe it's episode 193, I'll put a link in the show notes. We interviewed Andy Weir, who was the author of, I believe it's Andy Weir, yeah, the author of The Martian. Is that right? Yeah, Andy Weir. Aaron was real excited. We got a chance to interview Andy Weir, who was the author of The Martian, way back in the day. So this was probably been more than 10 years or so. Aaron was very excited about it. I'd never read the book, but I did watch the movie. Don't necessarily have any interest in going to Mars, although that seems to be one of the goals of SpaceX. So that's our first Kevin Bacon. Our second one is we had a family friend, a neighbor of ours growing up, who their daughter went on to be part of the NASA team that helped launch and land the Mars rover. So that's my second Kevin Bacon that's sort of related to SpaceX. My third one is that guy that I grew up with, guy I went to middle school and high school with, not necessarily a friend, but somebody I knew, and I knew the name. Gentleman who at the time used to be called Kevin Brogan, and now goes by the name Brogan Bam Brogan. I only bring him up because he is now often mentioned as one of the early members, early employees of SpaceX. So probably got super rich or will be getting super rich. So those are my 3, 1 or 2 degree Kevin Bacons away from SpaceX. Doesn't really matter, just makes for sort of interesting conversation. Anyways, today what I want to talk about on the show is, again, one of the, what I call top 10 things enterprise CIOs are thinking about is they're thinking about their enterprise AI strategy. And this one is all about harnesses and really the idea of, is it possible, will it be possible to create sort of an enterprise harness? So the ability to create kind of company-wide ways in which your company's going to interact with AI, your tools are going to interact with AI, your employees are going to interact with AI. And I've heard it as somewhat of a conversation that's beginning to happen, especially as we're hearing more about sort of harness engineering. But those are always kind of specific to certain tasks. And I want to kind of explore a little bit if we're going to eventually see in the future companies trying to build out more of what would be kind of an umbrella type of enterprise AI harness across a lot of different functions and capabilities. We're going to dig into that right after the break. This episode is brought to you by Outshift, Cisco's incubation engine. AI agents today operate in silos, limiting their potential. Scaling up models isn't enough. We need to scale out. Like humans did 70,000 years ago, agents must share knowledge, goals, and innovation to evolve. Outshift by Cisco is building the Internet of Cognition, transforming isolated AI systems into orchestrated superintelligence. This open infrastructure enables agents and humans to share intent, context, and reasoning. The cognition evolution for agents is here. Learn more at outshift.com. That's outshift.com. Today's show is sponsored by ShareGate. You're out of time. Copilot needs to be deployed ASAP, but your tenant really isn't ready for it. Years of data, permissions, and users lurk in its shadows, ready to be exposed by AI. ShareGate Protect sees it all, so you can find the exposure risks, fix them fast, and deploy AI with confidence. Microsoft 365 governance, they've got this. Learn more at sharegate.com/protect. Today's show is sponsored by Nasuni. There's a growing gap in AI right now between what's possible in theory and what successfully works at scale inside an enterprise. The difference comes down to unstructured file data. Many AI initiatives struggle because the file data they depend on is scattered, unstructured, and disconnected from where and how work actually happens. Nasuni changes that. It brings your unstructured file data into a single, secure foundation so AI, both generative and agentic, can access it with the context, governance, and performance it needs in production. Bring AI to where your unstructured data lives. See what it takes to activate your data for AI and request a demo at nasuni.com/AI. And we're back. And, as I mentioned at the top of the show, I've started hearing kind of this, collective discussion that's going on amongst various enterprise leaders and amongst folks who are, building out new technologies and looking for ways to sort of harness, what's possible with enterprise AI, as well as make sure that they're doing it in a way that's going to become sustainable from a security perspective, an ROI perspective, and a bunch of other things. And it feels like they're all kind of circling around this idea of, what they understand and have come to understand with kind of harness engineering, right? So the idea of, I want to begin to build some capabilities above and beyond just prompts and the model itself, things that are going to be a part of every interaction that happen, that put some sort of guardrails and controls, build some personality around what's going on, kind of rules around, which data should be used, which tools should be used, all those sort of things that we tend to do today around sort of harness engineering for our own individual projects, but beginning to do that in a way that may be a little more broadly applicable for the enterprise or for your individual organization. It may not be completely enterprise-wide. And I've seen it written. I grabbed a couple of links put in the show notes around people that are starting to look at this from a couple of different perspectives. Some of it are looking at it from the perspective of, how do we get people onboarded into these systems in a consistent way, or make it available for them to know what's available to them, sort of the catalog, sort of self-service catalog approach. But I want to kind of walk through a couple of these different things and sort of think about where they're probably going to fit together, where they make sense at a broad organization level versus an individual level, and and where we may start to see these things start to evolve over time. So the first one I had was the idea of just kind of the classic thing that happens within enterprises, which is we want to have both the ability to give our teams a certain amount of innovation and flexibility, but also we want to have certain controls. We want to be able to sort of have some visibility as to what's going on from a cost perspective, a usage perspective. We understand patterns of what's happening so that we can evolve. And this is, we're already beginning to see this around people offering or building their own sort of models as a service or agents as a service, right? So the idea of I want to do a couple of different things. I want to be able to give access to my people some set of centralized services. So that may be centralized access to a number of different models, so different size models, different capabilities of models, different price points of those models, and so forth. I want to do that across some sort of shared resource, some sort of shared GPU resource that could just be a big pool of GPUs that get allocated on a per team basis, per project basis. It could be sharing of those GPUs. So we're seeing different technologies allowing us to, kind of logically partition out GPUs. And this is always sort of an interesting starting point, right? This kind of follows along the, as a service model that we've seen be successful with infrastructure as a service, to a certain extent with platform as a service. We've seen, all of the major hyperscalers, be able to offer this. And this offers kind of a nice mix of flexibility between, giving the people that you're delivering these services to some basic primitives to go deal with. You have a certain amount of control over what's going on. So maybe you're offering 8 or 10 different models that are available. You're keeping up with them so that they're getting access to relatively new ones. Maybe there's some mechanism so that you have version control, so that as people are having to modify their applications, they can keep API consistency or whatever. It also allows you to put some controls around things like semantic routing. So which one of these models has certain costs? Should we be sending things outside of the enterprise and be out to public cloud services or API services? So, you get those typical kind of controls that you would have had in, as a service types of things. The second thing we start to see is people thinking about, okay, as we're seeing, as we've talked about in a couple of different shows, kind of costs being variable, within an organization. People starting to build out this idea of sort of semantic routing models. So, some more intelligence that you can bring to an application team or a set of services you have, in which you're kind of saying, hey, we can put multiple types of models out there and make them available to you. And we can help you build some semantics around when some part of your application, subset of your prompts, some interaction you're having should go to more frontier-centric models, right? So maybe they're bigger models, maybe they're models of experts or whatever you might be. Maybe what you're doing is specific to, building out images or building out video or building out, specific kind of content that maybe it's marketing centric content, whatever it might be. The ability to start to do semantic routing to models, right? So offering a little more intelligence, some awareness of what those applications are. And again, these aren't fully harnessed types of things. These have to do with, onboarding and routing and so forth. But they do begin to provide, again, certain guardrails or really sort of certain hiding of things that you maybe don't necessarily need to expose to everybody in the organization. You're looking to give them kind of a mix of choice as well as a certain amount of consistency of what that experience looks like. So maybe that experience is on a cost basis. Maybe it's on a, how fast the responses are. So you can give them a, kind of a performance indicator. And then, maybe a certain amount of it has to do with, look, you work in a regulated industry or the thing that they're working on, involves customer information, PII information. And you want to make sure that information is handled properly because most likely the people that are working on the application don't necessarily know all the nuances of things they have to comply with, how the data has to be stored, who's allowed to access it, whether that access is going through, a human authentication or a human ID or an agent ID or an agent authenticated thing. So, you start to get into, okay, again, trying to find that balance between giving your teams flexibility and the ability to innovate, delivering a certain amounts of consistency where it makes sense. And again, that consistency could be a lot of different things. It could be the onboarding process. It could be the performance of the service. It could be a cost metric. It could be a lot of different things. And then we start to get into some stuff that is going to be interesting to see sort of how it works out. And, I know a lot of us follow along to, Clouded Judgment, Jamin Ball, who's been on the show before. He wrote an interesting article this week that he titled Systems of Record Won the SaaS Era, Clearinghouses Will Win the Agents Era. And really what he was kind of getting at was this idea of clearinghouses being good for four things. Really what he was looking at is, as this discussion is going on of people beginning to think about how they're building new applications, maybe they're going to replicate what a SaaS did, or they're going to do a capability, again, a sort of an as a service capability. And he began looking at, the thing that made SaaS services sticky, or the thing that made them have essentially a moat, was their ability to control the system of record, right? The sort of canonical source of truth. And he was saying, well, in an agent world, yes, that's still going to be somewhat true. I mean, there's always going to be certain systems of records, kind of canonical sources of truth that you're always going to want to come back to. But as we start to get into models and we start to get into, kind of swarms of models and models doing different types of things that are emulating both automated tasks as well as human tasks, you're going to start to sort of get into multiple things that something, and he calls it a clearinghouse in this manner, might do that's going to provide a certain amount of sort of harness or enterprise level consistency for your agents. And the things that he highlights were memory, right? What your agents know. Again, this has to do with both their memory from any individual task that they're off doing, where that might be stored, how that might be kept, as well as any sort of, sources of data that they're pulling from. The second was context, right? So, how do you have some sense of what are they doing if they go off and run some task for 24 hours or 48 hours or whatever, what's going to be the visibility that somebody who may ultimately be responsible for the output of that task, how will they be able to see what's going on, how well it worked, how well it was, how well it performed the task versus failed along the way and adapted along that. So again, just like a manager is going to do, looking at his employees' work or their work or, those types of things, how do you have context? Execution, right? What they're allowed to do. So what are they allowed to talk to? What cost parameters do they have? Where do they store information? All this sort of execution things so that you can, again, where you need repetition, where you need consistency, that you can see, is that happening? How much divergence is happening? And then finally, he talks about governance, right? Who's allowed to do what? What's the audit trail? What are the things that, have to be in place for compliance and all that stuff? And it's interesting for him, he kind of dives into this idea of the clearinghouse being, again, kind of a lot of those centralized controls that, we have in place for both systems today, applications and systems today, but also for, human interactions. Just, if you, for example, are customer service agent, most of your stuff being recorded, and it could be recorded for compliance reasons. It could be recorded for legal reasons. If some sort of dispute comes up, it could be recorded just for training reasons. how do we put those types of things in place for agents and more agentic types of systems? So that clearinghouse concept becomes yet another sort of piece of this holistic puzzle of what an enterprise harness starts to look like, right? So we talked about, sort of the onboarding piece, models as a service or agents as a service, being able to, give people primitives, give them flexibility, but also, having certain amounts of control over, what are the pieces of those raw materials for what they're building. We look at, semantic routing so that people don't necessarily have to be thinking about the agents or the models on the back end. They don't have to think about which API am I using, how much do things cost. You can put things in their terms. We start to think about sort of these clearinghouse ideas in terms of, once the work starts to begin, how do we make sure that we've got visibility as to what's happening with those things? How do we do it on a consistent basis? And then I think the other one that's going to be a big part of this kind of harness idea is, kind of the extension of what we already do today around skills or prompts, prompt harnesses, and so forth. And I think that's going to be an interesting thing to figure out, because what this begins to involve, and we've talked about this on recent shows, is, you're going to have domain expertise within any sort of aspect of your business the same way you do today. Your legal department understands you not only, a legal domain, but also, the legalities of your business. Your sales organization understands, the selling process, but also the uniqueness of your products. Your engineering teams understand the things that your customers do with your technology in the unique way that they tend to do it. So for example, if you are in the, commercial consumer automobile industry, you understand those sort of use cases. If you're building trucks and tractors, you understand that while you're still building transportation, that's different and unique to what you do. And so, all those things are going to have to kind of get codified and put into these, into these harnesses for any given task. The question then becomes, how do you begin to share these types of things, right? How do you begin to have, one group, maybe you build 5 or 6 different products, how do you begin to have those groups share those types of capabilities? How do you begin to look at them? And are there ways to look at aspects of those different sort of skills and harnesses that might be reusable in other things, right? We've seen this, for example, in the automotive industry, and I go back and I always date myself to these Detroit references, but if you look at any sort of automobile company, they're very much reusing things over and over again, right? They're reusing aerodynamics, they're reusing engine design, they're reusing, all sorts of, user experience and so forth. They do it at different price points, and they do it at different velocities and so forth. But, that ability to codify that into harnesses or skills that, are being worked on a specific task or a subtask also become part of this bigger sort of harness story. And so I think what's going to be very, very interesting is, we've seen for a while now, for the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of sort of bottom-up innovation that's happening in AI, right? People are figuring out how to do this for individual tasks. We've talked over the last couple of shows that it has been challenging to see collaboration happen. It's been challenging to, have teams figure out how to take their learnings and spread them out. But as a CIO, as you're looking at this problem, you're really kind of trying to figure out, okay, how do I get the best of both this bottom-up innovation that's happening, but do it in a way that, you start to get some visibility. What's working? What's not working? Which tools are you using? Which processes have you sort of reinvented with AI that are different than what you did before, when it was, some combination of humans plus just computer automated tasks and so forth, right? So they're looking for, what sort of innovation's happening, what things are speeding up a process, what things are taking steps out of a process and so forth. And then figuring out, okay, how do I take the learnings from that and be able to share them centrally with other teams so that they can benefit from that. Their learning curves don't have to be as long. They don't have to have exactly the same expertise in terms of every single team figuring these things out. That prompt engineering, that harness engineering, those building of skills, the sharing of skills. You don't want to necessarily have to invest in every single group as if they're a startup. You want to be able to go, okay, some groups figured certain things out. What can we share? And I think the combination of, doing it from a catalog perspective, doing it through a clearinghouse, doing it through the ability to route to certain things so that you're hiding complexity from people, but also how to put expertise sort of behind those routes. And then, other, kind of common things that we have today in place, gateway controls. So where can I get to? Where do I have to block things? Where can I put cost controls? Where can I put security controls? All those things are going to be part of this bigger harness that CIOs are going to have to be thinking about. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see how the pieces come together. I think it's going to be interesting to see, how much do we see of previous kind of ways that enterprises thought about kind of balancing innovation and control, where they put safeguards, where they put sort of firewalls and blockers and so forth. How much of that they try and replicate in an AI context versus where do they start thinking about things differently than they did before, maybe begin to go, oh, well, while that thing we used to do a decade ago, five years ago worked, but it always had this barrier to it. And maybe we don't have that barrier anymore as we start to get into an AI perspective. So I'm going to be very, very interested in, as I'm listening and talking to different enterprises, talking to different CIOs, how they're beginning to think more and more about these more holistic things. Because at the end of the day, organizations go through, all sorts of ebbs and flows, whether it's acquisitions, whether it's, hiring booms, layoffs, market changes, and they have to, rearrange and reprioritize and reorganize what their groups do. The more they can, not have to reinvent the wheel every time that happens. And especially with AI tools, because there can be so much intelligence that's just sitting there in memory, in context, in execution, in governance. You want to be able to bring that to other things. So I'm going to be very interested to, again, watch how these enterprise harnesses, whatever combination of things they are, what are the tools that are going to be part of that? What are the structures going to be part of that? But then also, more importantly, what are the architectures going to be, and where are we starting to see companies, begin to reinvent themselves because they didn't just follow the previous model. They're trying to find ways to leapfrog stuff. They're rethinking certain areas and so forth. So I think it's going to be very, very interesting. I'll be curious, if people are already beginning to think about this, would love to hear your feedback. Show at theenterpriseaishow.com. Hit us up. We'd love to hear what you're doing. We'd love to hear how you're going about doing it. Or, if you are, building technology that's a core piece of that, especially if it's something that we've missed here, we'd love to sort of hear about that and why that's going to be really critical. So anyways, with that, I'll wrap it up. Again, apologize for this being out roughly a day late, but I am going to try and get back to the Wednesday and Friday cadence of getting these shows out. We'll do the best I can. Work's a little bit choppy and really busy right now, but I'll be doing the best I can. I think this is going to be a better schedule, and we'll go from there. So thank you all for listening. Thanks for telling a friend. Thanks for bearing with some of the change we've been making lately. We're hoping this is all for the better, but I know we're making some changes. You're having to adapt to them, but thank you for that. Thanks for telling a friend, and we will talk to you next week.
Thanks for listening. Check us out at theenterpriseaishow.com for past shows, newsletters, and all things enterprise AI.